Sick reference though, bro.
Oh, thanks, bud.
Dude, your references are out of control. Everyone knows that.
The Mind's Eclipse is a Western visual novel released on January 25th, 2018 for Steam and available for PC and Mac. Due to the popularity of science fiction and cyberpunk at the moment, it's very surprising that this didn't catch on more. Well, I guess Markiplier played it for like 20 minutes, but personally I only ever heard of it from PC Gamer when they wrote an article comparing the game to System Shock. It was made by a relatively small team of about 8 people calling themselves Mind's Eclipse Interactive, so I guess they're going for a Team Ico thing for their naming convention. Development on the Mind's Eclipse began in 2015, with the first post on their website featuring alpha footage being put up on November 22nd of the same year. Now, visual novels usually aren't the most traditional gameplay-heavy experiences, instead putting the narrative front and center. And for the sake of preserving the game for those interested, we'll not touch on the plot in any way beyond the setup and talking about some vague subject matter. Basically, I won't try to do any plot analysis, considering the last time I made an attempt at something like this for a visual novel, it went over pretty poorly. The game starts with a cutscene that will make much more sense towards the very end of the game, and the player takes control of a man named John who wakes up with amnesia in a medical bay on a space station. He's greeted by an AI named L, who informs him that he has to escape from the bay before the oxygen supply runs out. As John and L go into the space station proper, John learns of another AI called Cozy, struggles to piece together the history of the station and his own past, and determine who he can trust, if he can anyone at all. Setup-wise, this is nothing new or novel, but the Mind's Eclipse does enough differently to keep fans of the subgenre guessing as the plot unfolds. The Mind's Eclipse is played from the first-person perspective, with John's point of view being depicted through mostly still images that the player can traverse through. Like most point-and-click adventure games, the player interacts with the environment by moving the mouse cursor over the screen to interact with items that they can glean information on, indicated by a blurring effect over a given item. The general abilities at the player's disposal are an inventory, the ability to read prior acquired messages, and the ability to move around the game world. The ability to manually move in between different chunks of the environment is actually a unique feature in visual novels to my understanding. Although this could just be due to my limited exposure to the genre. Please correct me otherwise. Movement is accomplished by either clicking on different chunks of the map screen, or occasionally on doors in smaller environments where the map isn't available. For my playthrough, I personally found the inventory to be somewhat useless. Unless I'm remembering it correctly, there wasn't a single point in the game where I had to go into it and use an item from it manually. When acquired items have to be used, the game will give you a text prompt when examining things. On top of this, there really aren't any puzzles present in the Mind's Eclipse, so the interactive inventory, complete with its own user interface and slots, comes across as a bit redundant. And despite talking up the navigation options in the game a second ago, it's worth noting that there aren't truly any divergent paths the player can take. It's an incredibly linear experience, with the reward for the small dead-end paths that you take being further backstory for the world and character details. For a game that does hinge on its narrative though, this is a suitable incentive. The general gameplay in the Mind's Eclipse is rudimentary, but the fact that the effort was taken to give some extra interactive elements does help boost the game. It isn't much, but it goes a long way. However, like the genre mandates, reading is the primary hook of the Mind's Eclipse. The text is split with a dialogue between John, Elle, and Cozy whenever it rears its head, and the memos and emails lying around that you can read from tablets, computers, and the inside of people's skulls. The memos and emails flesh out the game's backstory and seem like an additional aping of other science fiction games, namely the System Shock games, Doom 3, Soma, what have you. However, there's an odd problem present with how it's done in the Mind's Eclipse. Namely, the game limits the text to a single screen without any page scrolling option being present. For something centered around reading, it's not exactly clear why this choice was made, and frankly it comes across in some ways as limiting the writing of these supplementary texts to a smaller scale. But this could also just be something I'm overthinking. The Mind's Eclipse has a rather distinctive art style. It's depicted in this scratchy black and white aesthetic, with the AI designs being more rounded and smooth, and one segment in a VR pod where the look changes completely. While I don't have any formal experience with art to back up my views, the look of the Mind's Eclipse works well within the context, although I will admit it does take some time to get accustomed to. The audio work is nice enough as well, albeit rather minimalistic. The soundtrack is a moody synthesizer collection, and it works well enough in context to provide a decent sci-fi horror atmosphere. Couldn't find it online though, so you won't be hearing it for this review. The sound effects here are limited to the bare essentials of indicating player interaction with certain objects, but the limited voice acting present is certainly interesting. It's the kind of thing I don't want to spoil, but its inclusion was something I didn't realize was present until later on in the game, and the revelation was certainly a neat moment. Now we're going to be entering the limited spoiler section, where the narrative will be touched on. There aren't going to be major plot spoilers, or any plot spoilers at all for that matter, and frankly I'm going to be incredibly vague about things, but going in blind to a game like this is usually the best idea. If you like what you've seen so far, then either skip to this point of the video, or just stop watching altogether. That's your prerogative. One thing about the Mind's Eclipse that was absolutely refreshing was how it isn't a cyberpunk story where the main concept is some variant of what really makes us human. This ground has been covered by many sources at this point, and while there arguably are some elements of this trope present with at least one of the characters, it isn't primarily what the game focuses on. It does utilize familiar ideas from cyberpunk fiction though, having them pop up in the world building and backstory. There's civil unrest, class divide, corporate dominance, robot wars, virtual reality, and all of the issues surrounding that, numerous bizarre future vices, the works. However, none of these feel as if they're too played out, as they're minor lore details generally. The actual story of the Mind's Eclipse uses these familiar tropes to go into a more human story, things most people would have an easier time empathizing with. The death of loved ones and the inability to let go of the loss, becoming deadlocked into a binary worldview, so forth. The story here doesn't overstay its welcome, moves at a brisk pace, although it does feel incredibly familiar in parts. Both structurally, as we went over prior, and in the reveal of a major plot element which feels fairly similar to a plot point in Soma. I don't think it's intentionally taking from it, as this game would have started production around the time this game first released, but this could just be an example of unintentional inspiration or synchronicity of the creative process. The Mind's Eclipse is a compelling little story and an interesting first game for a brand new studio. While the $10 price tag is a fairly steep point of entry for a 2-hour visual novel, it might be a worthwhile endeavor to pick this up on sale if anything you've seen so far appeals to you.